Well, hey there. It's your old pal Keith from groups.com, and we're talking more about Floppy. Over in the forum thread for Floppy, Future, cool handle name, Future asked me, so when you say that Floppy can store any bubble data type, does that mean that we can store API responses? And the answer to that is yes and no. In this video, I want to talk about using Floppy and data from the API connector, and we will cover topics such as can we use Floppy to cache API calls? The answer is yes and no. What can we do? How do we do it? If we want to play around with such things, what are bubble API response objects anyway, which is interesting to look at. And then there's a recently added feature that Bubble claims is not complete, so hopefully there'll be some improvements here, but there is a new raw body feature in API calls, and for certain types of API calls, you can, in the Bubble runtime, you can get the raw body response, just, the text to JSON blob that comes from an API response, and that's very useful in this context. And then we'll probably talk about the weird world of API data types, or what I sometimes call the API ghetto. And then I think we'll try to answer the question: is this even a good idea to do this? That is, try to cache API responses. Anyway, let's see where this goes. So I have a little project page. We'll get into the editor in just a second. But what I'm doing here is there's just some dates that are appearing here in my page. And this is just an array of dates that's coming from one of my own APIs. So I was just showing that, yes, this API is functional and it's returning some data to me. So this is just a list of dates. And then here's actually the full raw API body that's coming down to me. I'm capturing that. And then I've got a couple buttons. There's a floppy over here, and we've actually stored the raw body response from a previously made API call, and we're actually storing that in floppy. And so this is raw body text that has been stored in floppy's scalar value, and we're reading it back from storage. So you can do this. You can get raw responses, and then I'll show you what you can do with a stored raw body response. Okay, let's go into the editor for this page, and let's move my head. We don't need to be so big. Okay, so in this page, we've just got these two text fields. We've got a floppy. Floppy is configured like so. You can see from the logo on floppy that it's using IndexedDB local forage. All right, so storage type is IndexedDB local forage. Automatic retrieval is set to yes, meaning that if there's values stored at its keys, it's going to read them back. The type of values is text in this case, because we're using this floppy to read and write just a text field, a string that represents an API response. And I'm not. Oh, I guess I am using the list key, but I'm mostly using the scalar key here, and my scalar key name is set to API-resp for API response. This could be anything, but that tells you what it is, and then I've got a list of date strings, I guess. Let's see. When we go, most importantly, you can set the color of floppy, and in this case, I've made it a red one. That's really the most important feature in floppy. And then, of course, when we're using IndexedDB, we select a database name and a data store name. And so I've just chosen to put these keys over in a database called API demo. Makes a lot of sense, right? And then my data store is called API_calls. Note that when you're using IndexedDB, your data store name is supposed to not have spaces in it. I'm not sure exactly why this is the case, but anyway, what local forage does is if there's spaces in it, it's going to transform them into underscores anyway. So just a little thing to know. That's why I have an underscore here for my data store. It's called API calls. And so if we were to go into our console, I just hit F12 there to open the dev tools. I don't want my console, I actually want my application. So in application, you'll remember from previous videos about Floppy, this is where we can see our storage areas. And in this case, where I'm writing is under IndexedDB. Let's see, is this right? Let's see. IndexedDB and then Loom. And I'm being a derp because I'm looking in the editor. Of course, the editor is not where my keys are. They're over in dummy dum. Oops. Now I just went full screen. Don't do that. Let's see here. I wanted to be in my preview mode. Now that I'm in preview mode, I'm seeing what I expect. I go under IndexedDB, and now here's my API demo database. And then underneath that, you'll see that I have a data store called API_calls. And in here, if we expand this out a little bit more, we can see our API response. All right, so that's where we can write stuff. Okay, now that we've established that, let's look at how we get a raw response from an API. And let me close this so I don't confuse myself again. I'm in the editor. So there's a new feature in the API connector, and it looks like this. Let's see here. Here it is. When you do, this is a data call, obviously, right? So what I'm doing here is I'm calling my own API, okay? It's called iCall from URL, blah, 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 blah. It's a data call, and what this does is calls a Google Cloud function that I have set up, and it's a little bit of code that it takes a URL for an iCal feed and a time zone, and it goes and fetches that iCal feed and then spits a bunch of data back in a form that's useful in Bubble. So for example, here in this call, I'm doing the call, and then I'm looking at the body of the calls. I had starts there. Those are just that's just a list of dates that tells me when the events that are in this iCal file start. Okay, but we can also, using this raw body text feature, we can also just get the API response itself, just the JSON as text that's coming back from the connector. And there's a couple of things to know about this. For a call to be able to do this at present, because apparently this feature isn't finished, you have to have the call set up in a certain way. You have to be capturing the headers, and you also have to capture the error response. And so there's two checkboxes that will be clicked. It's highly likely that any API calls that you already have set up future probably don't have those options checked. And so if you did want to use this technique where you can do a call and then, instead of all the things that the API connector has parsed, down at the very bottom, you'll find raw body text. Okay? And so let's format this a little bit differently. So we're doing the call like right when the page loads, and it's getting displayed in this text element. Okay, so that's what we see when we go over here. Let's de-expand that a little bit, and we'll wait for this page to refresh. Okay, and then up here at the top, here's the raw body response that we just got. Okay, now let's show the special things that need to be set up to make that happen. And then, we'll show an alternative way to get the body text. Okay, so if we go into plugins, right, I would go to my API connector, all right, and then in my API connector, and I'm getting little Slack alerts, in my API connector, here's this API. It's called iCal from URL. It uses Google Cloud. That's what the name means. And I've got several calls. So here's my data call that fetches an iCal from a URL, right? And if I expand this, what you'll see is, it's just set up to do a thing, right? It takes the in URL and the time zone and then returns stuff to me. These are the two options I'm talking about. Like for the raw body text feature to be available to you, it'll be available to you, but if you select it, and these two options include errors and allow workflow actions to continue, must be true, and then capture response headers has to be clicked. If those aren't clicked, what'll happen is you'll never see any raw data in the response. And since this feature isn't finished and documented yet, at least I don't think it's documented, we don't know if this is a bug or a feature. So we don't know if it's intended to work for any call or if this is just a requirement of it. We also don't know what other features might come with that in the future. Like it would be cool, for example, to instead of having to ping the API connector, if I could take a raw body response that I've previously stored and just run it, run it into the API connector and rehydrate that into an actual API object. I don't know if that's going to be a feature or not, because at present, what we have to do to take one of these raw body responses and rehydrate it is we have to set up a back-end workflow for ourselves. We basically have to make an API endpoint in our app that can understand that. It's not hard to do, but there's some steps, and we'll talk about that. Sorry, this is a pretty complicated topic, and it's easy to get distracted. So the point of this is to use the raw body text feature, you have to have these options turned on. And now, when you do click those for the first time, or like if I untoggled these right now, I would have to reinitialize this call, okay? Because that response is very different. I'll click reinitialize call right now. And so you see when we do that, here's all my configuration stuff. If you don't have those two options checked, you would usually not see all this other stuff. So there's all this error status code stuff, error message, blah, 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 blah. Like that's that first option is we're allowing the API connector to capture errors. And then you'll see all these header fields down here. And so when you have the option clicked to capture headers, you're going to see your headers. And so, if you didn't have those options turned on before, the API, connector data is different. And so you have to reinitialize the call. Of course, to know what the raw data looks like, right? We've always had this option, show raw data. So we've always been able to do this, right? And we can copy this text out of here. This is the JSON of what the response looks like, right? We've always been able to copy that, but we haven't been able to get it previously in the runtime, like we're doing here, right? There, I magically made it appear in the runtime. Okay, we'll save that. Now, what is the next thing we want to talk about? Well, that's how we got our raw response. There's another way we could do this. So let's say that we don't like that option. Or we didn't want to turn these on, but we still wanted to get raw body text somehow. How would we do that? What you can do is if you right click, right, in in one of your calls, you can hit this option called duplicate, and you can just make a clone of it. Now I've already done that, so I'm not going to do it again here. But this next call down here, that I've called iCal from URL, parentheses, raw text, it's set up exactly the same as the call above it, right? It pings the same endpoint. It sends the same data. But instead of me saying, oh, it's JSON, the response is going to be JSON, right? So in this case, it's JSON. In this one, which is a clone, again, of the one above it, I just select text. And now, we can reinitialize this. I guess it's safe to do that. And see now, Bubble just treats it as text. But so that's pretty cool. And so now I could, in my page, I could get a similar response to what I did here, right? So like right here, this one, iCal from URLs raw body text. Let's see, alternative method to get body text. Okay, I would do this other call. So I would say get data from an external API. I want the iCal from URL, iCal raw text. It's this one, iCal from URL auth uses a G-Cloud, iCal from URL raw text. And now see, there's no more here. It's just like, oh, well, this is just a text, right? And so, so I can print it out in my page. Let's change this formatting here a little bit. All right. And now if we go and reload this page, and hopefully it doesn't take a month to reload this page, let's just see. Okay. So now I've got my API raw body that came from the raw body text option on that one API call. And then here's the output for my alternative method to get body text. Okay. There it is. So that's another way that you could get a response and just get it as text. Now that we have a way of getting a thing as text, right? We can store that in Floppy. And so like that's how I wrote this key over here, the API response key that's over here in API calls. Let's just look at how I did that. So back over in our edit mode, let's look at our workflows and see what we're doing here. Let's see. So we have a button API call that we can click. Okay. And if we click that button, we're going to make this call. Okay. So in this context, what I've done is I have a clone of that iCal from URL data call that here I've just got a version that's an action. It's kind of six to one to the other to the dozen, as my wife says, 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. Whether you use, calls as data or use them as actions, like in this context here, like if I have a button press or some other event, and I want to make an API call in a controlled manner, like that, actions are usually a little easier to understand. So we're actually using this iCal from URL action, and we're making a call to my endpoint. So I provide it with URL and a time zone, and it spits some stuff back to me that I could now reference as the results of step one, right? At this point, let's look at what an API response actually is in Bubble. We'll remove this and we will add it again. There's a neat little utility element that's in Floppy, and it's an action called a Floppy inspector. And so let's go get Floppy. You can find it here. It'll be at the bottom of your list, Floppy inspector. So we could find it by Floppy, or we can find it by inspector. And Floppy Inspector is like a super simple little action plugin. What it does is it lets you take a scalar value anything or a list value anything, and it just writes it out to the console. And so what we'll do is let's take Floppy Inspector and let's look at the result of step one. Okay. And then let's just continue on in this workflow. We'll show that in a second, but so we don't have to reload our page like a million times. So when we click that API call button, we do the API call, and then we're going to inspect it. And then in our third step, we're going to set Floppy's RAM scalar value in this case. And so let's actually change this so that we're using the right thing. We'll do RAM scalar value. We'll set it to the result of step one. And let's see, can we get the raw body text here? Let me just make sure I have that call set up right as an action. Let's see. If I'm in my plugins, let's look at the action, because I might not have turned this on. Yeah, okay. I'm including errors in response, and I'm capturing the headers, and so the raw body text thing is going to work for this call. Okay, so back over here in our workflows. Okay, we'll set the RAM scalar value. So now we're just like holding the raw body text in Floppy API responses RAM scalar. And then we set store new value to yes. So what it's going to do is it's taking this new raw body text from this call and it's going to write it into Floppy storage. And then we'll actually show, we're not going to show this yet. Set RAM list value, Floppy, I don't know why I had that. We're just kind of reconstructing things in real time. Okay, so I'm going to do the call, I'm going to inspect it, and I'm going to store it, is basically what this workflow does. So let's go over here into our run mode, and let's do that. As soon as this refreshes, okay, as soon as this refreshes, now I can go and I can click. It's a kind of a stupid place for this button, but whatever. It's down here. So let's click the API call button and see what happens. So all right, so we just made that API call, and then if we were to look in the console here, here's the output from Floppy Inspector. And so we see that Floppy Inspector tells us that the scalar anything that we got is, look at this, it's an object. It's an object with 3 functions on it. It has a get function and a list properties function. If you're familiar with Bubble things and like Bubble plugins, you'll be familiar with stuff that looks like this. So things in Bubble, like your custom data types, they're also like this. They're an object with 3 functions on it. There's a get function that a plugin can use to get a specific property of the element. And then there's this list properties function that's on them that actually just tells us what all those parameter names are, what those property names are. And then we use those in get to like get the values that are there. And this is how Bubble internally like uses objects. And the difference between an API response and a thing in Bubble, which they look exactly the same, is that a thing has a property called ID, and that's the unique ID field for that thing. And so like in my plugins, like a while back, I updated some of my plugins like List Popper and Friends, and well, Floppy itself as I was building it so that they can properly support things versus API calls. Because how I used to differentiate things is like, oh, well, the thing has list properties and it has get, but I added a third condition, like if it has a property called ID, then it must be a thing. If it doesn't have a property that's ID, it is probably an API response. Now, it is true that an API response could have a field on it called ID, and you wouldn't be able to tell if that is a thing or it's an API call, but that's what we have to do in our plugin code. So anyway, why am I showing this to you? So one, it is kind of interesting just that an API response object is like a thing, and it has list properties and it has get on it. This other function, by the way, this third function, underscore original, or actually it's underscore original, I think. This is where all the bubble magic is. And in plugins, there's no, we can't access that. Like if we try to run that function, like nothing will happen. It says, oh, you're not allowed to call this. This is where all of the magic is. I've inspected this function a little more deeply because we can write some code to sort of intercept it and tell us a little bit more about it. And it's just full of like all these different properties that are like, it's basically just Bubble. And it's kind of weird. Like our plugins would use list properties and get to access the properties on this API response. But even if we do some weird stuff, like we write our own get function and we write our own list properties function and we try to like impersonate an API call, or we try to impersonate a thing, that doesn't work. And because all of the Bubble internal stuff is under this original function. So anyway, that's just a little aside about like these kind of objects in Bubble that's really only of interest to like super nerds and plugin builders. But the point about this is that this object and with functions on it, it isn't serializable. We can't we can't convert functions to text. We can in certain contexts uh, actually kind of print the raw code of a function, but when we're in the web page, when we're in a runtime, um, functions have a whole bunch of other stuff in them. It's not enough just to like save the code of the function. It's compiled code, and we can't turn that into a string. It just doesn't have that representation, and so it can't be stored in session storage or local storage, which where we have to stringify our values before we save them. And further, it can't be stored in IndexedDB because the objects just aren't serializable anyway. And so that's why we have to use the raw body response to represent this object. Okay, so that's what an API response is. And then what we did in our workflow, right, is so after we inspected this thing, Floppy Inspector like spat out this interesting information for us, we went and we updated our storage over here in IndexedDB to be the new API response. So we can save, we can save text. I guess I should refresh this. I mean, we won't really see it anyway. But we can't save the API response object, but we can save the raw body text of the response. And I guess if I hover over this, I see the full thing. And you're just going to have to trust me, unless you're a very quick reader, that this call was really made right now. Okay, so what good is it if we have the raw response saved? Obviously, as we just discussed, this text isn't this. Like, it isn't this object, but it is a representation of the response. And presumably we could rehydrate that response like back into a bubble object, right? Where we could then access it in the expression builder and stuff like that. How do we do that? Well, what we'd have to do until Bubble maybe updates this raw body text feature with some enhancements. Like, I'm hoping that the presence of this get raw body text feature means that in future we'll be able to take the text, the JSON raw body response, and use that instead of actually making a call to some endpoint, that we might just reparse data that we'd previously saved, like back through the API connector, to essentially rehydrate that response back into a Bubble API response object. Now, I can't tell you if that feature is actually coming, or when it will, if it is, but that would be my hope for this. Now, in the meantime, how would we rehydrate something like this? Well, it's going to involve a little chicanery. You'll see in my preview, right, I've got this other button. So we've got this API call where I can click it again, where we actually just took a response from the API using an action, right, and we stored it over in our IndexedDB storage. I've also got this button that says recover stored API call. And so let's look at how we would recover or rehydrate an API call. So if I go over into my edit mode, right, and we look at the setup on this button, so this is when button recover stored API call is clicked. We call this other, we make this other API call, and I've called it my own app. That's the section it's in, parse raw iCal, and I have it set up as an action. And you'll see that what it takes is it takes a single parameter called raw response. Okay, and so what I'm going to send this, we'll look at the setup of this in a minute, but what I'm going to send this guy is that JSON response that we just got from my Google Cloud function, and that's stored in Floppy API responses scalar value storage. Like this is the value that's currently stored in that storage location. Okay. And so I'm just sending that raw JSON, okay, as the raw response. So how is this guy set up? If we go back into plugins, and hopefully I don't thrash around with this too much. What I've done here is I have this API that I've called my own app, okay? And what it is it's literally one of my own it's going to contain one of my own endpoints, all right? So if you haven't ever exposed your workflow API so that you can do backend workflows, this is what you have to do. Let's see. We would go into our settings. And future, you'll forgive me if you already know all this stuff. We'll go to the API tab, and first we'll enable the workflow API and backend workflows by checking this button, and then this gives us a URL that is used for our endpoints. There's also a data API, and I do have my data API enabled for certain of the things here, but really this is the only option we need turned on. We need to enable workflow APIs and backend workflows. Now, your workflow API endpoints, you can set them up to be private, and require authentication, or they might be public endpoints that don't require authentication. In this case, for this parse call that I'm going to set up, I wanted to make that one private. And so what you do is you issue yourself an API token. So I've set up an API token here that says it's called a my own app, right? And this is the private key for my own app, okay? And so now when I set up a call under here, I've just made it so that all of my calls require authentication, and you got to read the docs. But basically what you do is if you want to use authentication, you will select private key in the header, and then the key for authorization is called authorization, and the key value is bearer space that token value that came from over here, okay? And so that's how you can make this API for your own app. You can make it private. It requires authentication. And now, here's my parse raw ical action. So what I did is I added a new API call, and let's look at it. So I've set it up as follows. So it's parse raw ical action, use as action. I usually label my API calls with data or action in them. I know you can see that in the editor, but I just find that it helps. The data type is going to be JSON, okay? And then the post, you'll see that this is the this is the base URL for my workflow API, right? If we go back over into settings, now that I've exposed backend workflow, all of my endpoints are hanging off of this URL. So it's /wf/ the endpoint name that we want to access. And so in this case, I have a backend workflow called parse ical, okay? So layers and layers here, right? So what happens is I hit this endpoint called parse ical, and I send it, right, a body type that's JSON, and I get this parameter called raw response, and that's just see, it looks just like a response from my Cloud function. So what I did to initialize this thing is I manually entered the API response, okay? So we can do this, we can click there, and then we've got this text field, and I can just put a copy of what a response looks like. Now this response is actually a little bit out of date. So we're going to reinitialize this call, and then I'll show you what the call is, okay? But I think you can guess. All right, so let's just grab this. Here's a sample. Oops, here's a sample API call. We're just going to select this text, okay? I just wrote this out into a text element. so that I could see it in the page, but I also did it so that I could do this. So I can copy this text. Okay. I'm going to go back over here and enter this as the API response. Now, it's going to look ugly here, but when you're done, whoops, looks like it doesn't like that. What did I do wrong? I don't think it liked that. Let's try that again. Let's try that again. Why, there it goes. There it's saved. Okay. So what you'll note is that, so it looked ugly there, right? But now if I show the raw data that we just got, oh, it's all nice and pretty printed for me. So it doesn't matter that it's all jumbled up like that. It's still proper JSON. And so, here I just set up the parsing of this response to be just like I did in my original Google Cloud function call, right? And so this is the part I didn't have before. Like I didn't have the error message stuff just yet. Let's see. Am I doing this right? Yeah. Capture response headers. Well, see, in this case, we don't really have any headers that come back to us. The headers are different. You're right. It's a different situation because we're calling a completely different API. But anyway, now we've got our, I don't think I saved what I did I? Let's do that, save, and let's see. Did I have this set up right? It doesn't really matter because this is just a demo. But I mean, I'd want to make sure that, the things that are coming back as dates, I'm reading as dates, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Then I'll just save this. Okay. Now, what this does is it parses a JSON response, just like my Google Cloud function. Let's demonstrate what it does. We're just calling the action here. We should probably put the data somewhere so that we could see it, right? Well, we could just reference it here in the workflow. So you'll see that if I do, let's do result. Oops. Well, I don't get a result here, do I? Let's store it somewhere. So let's see. I don't get a result. Well, here's an idea. Let's just make ourselves another floppy because it's a convenient. We'll use floppy like a custom state. That'll make it kind of easy to illustrate what's coming back there. So let's see. Just do a floppy. We'll make a new floppy on the page. Whoops! I hate when that happens. Made little tiny. Let's see. Let's make this floppy. Well, it could also. We're not really going to write anything from this, or we might. I don't know. Let's see. Type of values. These will be. Let's see. We could make it a parse raw ical action if we wanted to, I guess. But no, let's just make it. Let's see. Let's make it of like date type so that we could like see some of the dates that are coming back from our API response, I suppose. It's kind of weird to do this. All right. So let's see. So let's do, what did I call him? Oops, I didn't finish setting him up. He's floppy B. Let's call him floppy parsed. So this will be like the parsed response things. And then let's see. I'm going to remove the key names for now. And if I did want to write to storage, I would, select, what did we have this guy set up as? API demo, API calls. Sure. API demo, API calls. All right, whatever. Okay, in my workflow. So now what I could do is like we could set floppies. Let's see, we'll set a RAM scalar value, no, RAM list value, and in the floppy parsed. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying, okay, we're going to take some values from this step and we're going to save them into the RAM list in Floppy parsed. And so the RAM list value would be result of step one. See, now I can see all of the things that come back from that, right? And so you can see that these are actually the same. It's an API response, and these are actually the same fields that my Google Cloud Function API call returns. So what we've done is we've taken that raw response. I'll show you how this is done in a second. But the magic here is I've taken that raw response and I've rehydrated into an object that is not identical, by the way, to the original API call, but it has the same fields. And so now we're getting into that wacky world of API data types. But so I could set, let's see, days blocked is a thing that comes back. And so I could set the RAM list value to days blocked. And then, let's see, let's like print them out somewhere. Let's do like a text element, move my head. Let's do like a little text element over here. And we would just say, let's get floppy parsed RAM list values. Do we want to format them? We don't necessarily have to format them. Oh, I should put a label on here. So we know what we're looking at over in the runtime. So this is floppy. Sorry that takes so long. Floppy parsed RAM list values. Boop. All right. And so now when we go over here into our runtime, we'll refresh the page, right? Waiting for a bubble. How's everybody doing today? Doing good? I'm doing pretty good. So see, okay, so there's nothing in floppy parse RAM list values yet. But if we go over here, right, and let's do our API call, let's then recover our stored API call, we should see some values up here. Boop. We're not seeing them yet. Why did we not see them yet? Floppy's RAM list values. That's a list of dates. Do I have to format it? Format it as? Should just print them out. Let's do each item formatted as that. And let's also just check our workflow. Don't you just love these unrehearsed videos? My own app, floppy APIs, scalar value storage. Oh, wait. Floppy scalar value storage. Floppy APIs scalar value storage. Let's just make sure that there's a value in there. Floppy API calls. What are we doing? Floppy scalar value storage. Okay, yeah, there's the value. There's the value, right? Because we're printing it out to the page. Floppy API calls. Scalar value storage. I need to put a label on this. API call we stored in IndexedDB. Floppy, let's label this a little bit better. Floppy API call we stored in IndexedDB. Scalar value storage. Okay. API call we stored in IndexedDB. Reload the page. Really, I'm just doing something a little bit stupid. Floppy API, okay. Boop. Let's do the API call. Let's try to recover the stored API call. Still not seeing Floppy's parsed RAM list values. Floppy parsed RAM list values. Oh, I was sort of being a bonehead. I don't think there is any value in days blocked from this particular call. Let's look at starts. I'm not going to explain to you what these values are. It's my own API. It's all secret. Okay, so we're loading our page. Yeah. Keith, pick a field, Keith, where there's going to be data. How about that? So we'll do the API call, and then let's try to recover it. I'm not even going to edit this. I'm not going to edit this out, because it's kind of funny to watch me, do stupid shit, isn't it? I don't know. That's not working either. Well, you know what I seem to have done? I'm going to make my head big for a minute. It looked like when I was messing around with the initialization on parse raw ical action before, I was doing it wrong. And what I really meant to do here is to literally reinitialize the call and do it by providing a value here. And I think what I did before is something stupid. Let's just go and let's make sure this works. Got too many texts on this page and I confused myself. So here's a Floppy API call that we've stored in IndexedDB. I'm going to go get this one. I'm going to go get this one. Just the text, please. Copy it. Did I copy the right thing? Yes. I'm going to go back into here and I'm just going to do Control-All, Control-Paste, and then I'm just going to hit reinitialize call. All right. So yeah, so this is completely different. There we go. Now we're seeing the body stuff, etc., etc. I broke my call. Okay, I'm trying to show you how to do this, and then I broke my call in doing it. So let's see. Type is a text. UID is a text. Start is a date. Oh man, sequence. So you see what can happen here. Let's see. Transparency is a text. End is a date. Location is a text. Summary is a text. Class is a text. Date stamp is a date. Date stamp. Date range start is a date. Date range end is a date. Days blocked list is a date. Body error is a text, I guess. No sample data was sent, so we don't really care. Body ends list is a date. Body summaries is a text. The body descriptions field is now its own weird type called parse raw ical action body description. Body descriptions list is a text. Error status code is a number. Error body. Okay, now I have headers. It's weird that I didn't have headers before, but I will have headers now. Let's see if this works. I don't need to set anything else. I don't think I need to set anything else. We'll save. 2 issues. See? Now, yeah, right. Okay. Now we got to go back over to workflow. We're going to do a my own app parse raw ical action. We're going to send it the raw response from Floppy API's scalar value storage. Okay. Then we're going to set Floppy parse to be, see, this doesn't exist anymore because those fields have now changed. So we'll say set the RAM list value to result of step 1's days blocked. There will be days blocked in here now. I'm pretty sure of that. Let's see. And then I did a test. While I went away for a while, I did a little test. All right. I think this should work now. Let's try to recover this API call. And we should get some text up here. I also worked my data call while I was showing you guys stuff. All right, so we're going to show Floppy parse RAM list values here, and they should become populated after I hit this button down here called Recover Stored API Call. Yep, haha, there's Floppy parse RAM list values. Okay, what did this just show you? Well, this just showed you that one, the setup on this kind of thing is sort of complex. But what we did is we took a raw API response from my Google Cloud function. We stored that as text in a floppy, and then we rehydrated it, like we recovered it by feeding it into a different API endpoint, one that's in my own app. And so now that I unborked this action, okay, what I'm going to do is show you what's at this endpoint called parse ical. So this endpoint called parse ical is a backend workflow, right? And so I find that down here in my backend workflows. And you can see at this project, I only have this one, and it's this endpoint called parse ical. It's set up like this. I've exposed it as a public workflow. While I was debugging there, I unchecked this, but we can't run it without authentication now. We'll make it so that only I can run it, right? And I showed you that with the authorization bearer and the custom key that I generated for myself. We trigger this with a post action, and it just has one key that's raw response, and that's of type text. So, right, when we look at the setup for this endpoint, that's what we do, right? So here's my parse raw ical action, right? I post to its URL, right, which is this big long thing that ends in WF. All my workflows are hanging off of that endpoint / parse ical, right? And then we say that the body type is JSON. The parameters are raw response, and I provided a big, long, fancy raw response. Okay. And then what does it do in response? Well, we'll go back in here to our backend workflows. Okay. Parse iCal. Once it gets a response, it returns data from the API. And what it does is we just say it's a plain text. We're not actually going to parse what we got. We're just taking the raw body and we just send it back. We take that raw response and we send it back as text. And then the API connector, right? The API connector will see that JSON. That text is JSON. And so then the API connector, and we initialize the call, it sees that. It sees that as JSON. And then that causes the thing to get rehydrated. Does that make sense? I hope it does. It's pretty complex. Maybe I'll have to try this whole demo over again. Which maybe leads us to the other part of our discussion, which is, does this even make sense to do? So again, let's see if this is working right. So I could do an API call, and I've stored it in storage, and then I can recover it. And did I recover it? Yes, I did recover it, because we can get values here. Is this a good idea to do? I want to show my topics again. Let's see. We talked about raw body feature of the weird world of API data types. Is this a good idea? So one thing you'll notice is that since I had to use a completely different API call to recover or rehydrate the raw body response that I get from my Google Cloud function, this thing is a different data type. If we went and looked at, let's see here, what would we look at? Go to the workflows, not backend workflows, Floppy API. When we look at this recovered iCal action thing, right? And then we set the RAM list to be just, one thing that's hanging off that. If I instead wanted to save a whole bucket of stuff, we could do set state, we could set a custom state. Set state of an element. Let's pick our page, and let's set a custom state that's I don't know, I'm going to call it response thing. Response thing, state type. And let's see, this will be, when you have a different API, when you have a different API call, API calls all get their own type. So I could set this custom state to be a parse raw iCal action. And then, of course, underneath that, you saw that there was a body description because the description has multiple objects hanging off it. And then the event has things hanging off it. So we could set it to be a parse raw iCal action, right? And then the value would be the result of step 1, okay? And so then we could inspect this thing in the page. So we'll call it response thing. All right, so let's go back over here. Actually, I'm not ready to go back there yet, am I? Let's just add some other, let's remove this. Okay, let's look at response thing. And so insert dynamic data, we'll do, my page is called Floppy. That's where this custom state is. So we'll look at Floppy demo API's response thing. And then you see that, okay, so it's got body event, body days block, blah, 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 blah. This is, of course, a different type than the response coming from our JSON. So our Google Cloud function, he tried to say. So we could do Floppy demo API's response things, body starts, right? But this is of a different type than, I guess we're not saving that anywhere. Let's go back to our workflow. When we do button API call is clicked, we do this action. And so what we could do is we could set a different state. You could do this with Floppy too. You could give Floppy one of these wacky data types. but it would be strange. Set state of an element. We will do Floppy demo API. This will be a new custom state. This will be cloud function response thing. Right. And then the state type here is going to be iCal from URL data. Oh, why do I have two of them? This gets confusing. iCal, see, this is what happens when you're messing around. Oh yeah, I did make a copy of it. So let's see, I've got iCal from URL uses gcloud. I've got iCal from URL data, iCal from URL raw text, iCal from URL action. Oh yes, this action is a clone, I think. Let's see, iCal from URL data, iCal from URL action. Am I using that one? iCal from URL action. Okay, I am using that one. This is of type do 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 do. I'm gonna create a new thing. This will be cloud function response thing. I want to make it of type. I don't know why I have multiple types there, but I want the action one. So I need the iCal from URL action. Ooh, it's this. And it's still labeled data. It's labeled data because it was a clone, and I never reinitialized it. I remember now. This is a thing I wanted to demonstrate. This is actually the state type that's returned there. Value, result of step one. Okay, yeah, that works. So these are of the same type. So that's kind of interesting, right? How did this happen? So you see, I've got this iCal from URL data call, okay? And I was telling you, if you right click and you duplicate it, you can get a dupe of it. And it'll show up at the end of the calls list, right? And that's in fact what I did here. And then what I did is I labeled this one action and I changed its type to action, but I didn't actually reinitialize the call here. I think once I reinitialize the call here, what would happen is that this would become its own data type. So let's just test that. Let's see. And I'm not going to change any of these values. I just want to hit save. If I go back into my workflow and I look at, I have to be, okay, I got to look at the page, and then we have to look at this state that's hanging off it. Let's look at this. Let's look at his states. So now I've got a response thing, and I've got a cloud. Yeah, see, look at this. Now, see, now this became an iCal from URL action data type, and which is now distinct from iCal from URL data type. Interesting, right? So this is the wacky world of API data types. So you could see actually that your action and your action call and your data call, like they could represent the same data type if you did that trick where you duplicated and then you never reinitialized the second call. But that's fragile, of course, because well, if you do change your API does change. You change something about that one call. You're going to probably have to change it in the other call, and they won't be the same data type anymore. And also, that was just kind of confusing. But the whole point of this thrashing around here that we were doing is I was just showing that we've got this one response thing, and then we've got the cloud response thing, and these are of different types. So this is Floppy demo APIs. That's our page. Cloud function response things. We could do body starts or whatever. And let's change our formatting here. Okay. So now we're kind of doing the two parallel things where we're in the first step, like the get API call, let's see here. When we do this API call and we're calling the cloud function, now we've got this cloud response thing type, and we're just printing out some dates from it. And then when I rehydrate the stored API call, it's becoming a different type of thing, and it's the response thing that we're storing this other state. So these are, while the data that's hanging off of these two things is identical, the things themselves, the API responses themselves, are of different types. And so you couldn't put a list of like these API, the cloud API response things. You couldn't, if you had a list of those, you couldn't put a parse API response into that because they're different things. They're of different types. They have different data types. So that brings me to the question of like, is this even a good idea? Well, this is useful, right? So, you can recover a stored call. It's not going to be the same thing as, it's not going to be the same type of thing as the cloud function call, the original call. The reconstituted one will be of a different type. That might not be helpful to you. But the fields hanging off of these API responses are of consistent types, right? Let's show that. Or on second thought, maybe I'm not really ready to talk about that. So I watched what I did there earlier. I hope it wasn't too confusing. I didn't edit out that part where I was futzing with my parse API call. The issue was what I was saying before, that I hadn't reinitialized it since changing some other stuff. But yeah, I think you see generally how that process works. Now, when this issue of the parsed API response being of a different type than the original API response, is that an issue? Like, maybe it is, or maybe it's not, but it would sort of make for, kind of not really double the work, but you'd have to accommodate that, in any page that, where you use this technique, they're not going to be the same thing. And if you're, later storing them in your database, which you probably don't need to do unless you have, there's certain fields of them that you're going to take and, put in your database. That might be an issue. Like you might have to create a new kind of super thing to hold those two states. Like, so you have, a super thing that would have a type of original response, right? And then a field that's the type of the parsed, the rehydrated response. And, you could kind of work around things like that. You just might have slightly more complex workflows. Be like, okay, well, if I have this thing, do X, and I have the other thing, do Y. But maybe this could work for your use case. The one thing that I didn't talk about, that I probably should talk about, is, well, what happens if you try to use Floppy to, store one of these unparsable things? So, for example, or one of these non-serializable things, right? So, like we showed, let's see, where was I? We showed, how like we could use Floppy Inspector to see that, like, when things are unserializable. And while I went away to do some thinking, I was like, okay, well, let's use Floppy and try to write one of those things. And this is actually, I wasn't writing the API response itself. I was writing one of another object that's inside of the API response, and seeing what happens if we try to write that to IndexedDB. We will get an error. I'm not doing error checking in the current version of Floppy for this situation. If a thing is not serializable, it will throw an error that'll look like this. It'll say uncaught in promise, failed to execute put on the object store. Through this error, basically the thing could not be cloned. That's how IndexedDB local forage works internally. It clones the object and shoves it into storage. If that object cannot be cloned because it's not serializable, then that will fail. and you'll get an error in the console. So for example, I guess if show you how to do that. And maybe this is a good time to introduce Floppy Reader. So you probably noticed that in addition to Floppy, which lets you, read, write, and then to a single scalar and a single list key of the same type, there's also this thing called Floppy Reader. And a Floppy Reader, despite its name, I put one in my page right here, a floppy reader, despite its name, it can actually also write, and it can remove keys, but it has an interface that basically allows you to, from this single element, you can write and read 6 different scalar keys, which you set up. You have to define their types and you define their names, right? And 6 list keys. So again, the inputs for lists and scalars are different in Bubble. So we have to have a section for list keys and a section for scalar keys. Scalar keys are up here at the top. The list keys are down toward the bottom. And so you configure all those. And so you can read and write from like 12 things at a time. So it's like having 6 floppies on your page, which could make this kind of thing a little easier. If you didn't, for example, maybe want to do this trick of rehydrating calls, like maybe it's just enough for you to save the native Bubble data types, the simple data types that are hanging off of your API response, right? So in my case, this API that I was working with, I was demonstrating, it is designed to be Bubble friendly. Like it doesn't have, it does seem to have a nested object in it, but I'm never populating that. I'm not sure if that's intentional or not. It's not something that in this project I'm using. I might be using that in the real app that API calls a part of. But that aside, I've designed it so that there's just top level things, and they're not inside of objects. And whenever there's an object that's inside of the JSON, that becomes another unserializable thing for you, right? So, for example, here's a Floppy Reader. I put it on the page. The setup is very similar to Floppy, right? You can select local, session, or IndexedDB storage. It uses the same interface, the local forage interface. And then you give it down at the bottom. If you're using IndexedDB, you give it a database name. Here I've picked API demo. And then I'm using a different data store than for these floppies, where I used API calls. I'm using a data store called IRD API calls. You'll see that the icon for Floppy Reader has an RD for reader. So an IRD is a Floppy Reader that is reading and writing to IndexedDB. Similarly, if we would like to change that, here's one that's right in the local storage. Now it's an LRD, so you can kind of easily see in your page if it's big enough. You can see what type it is. Anyway, you can see what type of storage it's using at a glance. And of course, it's got the color change to thing. We could make him pink. Now, let's just show that, I guess. If we let's say we set up a type. There is a type in my API response. Let's see. It was iCal from URL action. There is an object under it called event, and there's an object under it called description. I don't know if I actually have any events coming back from this right now, but like if we selected that data type, right, and then we tried to write to it. So it's an iCal from URL action event, body event. Yeah. So let's say this is a body event as the key name. If I try to write that, I'm going to generate that same error. So let's just like do it just to demonstrate how that would happen. I'm going to say, I'll do this when button API call is clicked. What I will do is I will do a store keys, a Floppy Reader, and store keys is just like the store keys in Floppy, except that it gives you access to all 12 of the keys that are supported here. In this one, right, I only have key one defined, but then I say store key one, yes. And then I just have to provide it with the value of the type. And so this would be the result of step one's, was this body event? Body event. Yeah, body event. And let's see, why doesn't it like that? Is it a list? Oh, I think the event is a list. And my head is over my issue thing. See, store keys, Floppy value for Q1 should be iCal from URL action body event, but right now it's a list. Oh, okay. So that's a list. So that's a list. So we would go back over here, and instead of a single one, I want a list one. I mean, I could take first item. Well, let's just do it this way. So this is event. There we go. I come body event, and that's a list. So this is a body event list, right? Then we'll go back over here and fix this problem. We're not going to store key one. We're going to store list key one. Store list key one. What's the value for list key one? Result of step one's body event. Oh wait, body event. Body event. Oh. I got from URL body event. I got from URL action body event. Duh. Boy, oh boy. It gets confusing when you've got like so many like little different things. Okay, now we've got now that list value resolves. If we try to do this, I don't know why I'm taking so long just to show you how to generate an error. But now when we do this, we should throw this error because the thing's not serializable. Now, you could go get its body text. You could actually get that thing's body text. You could do the same thing where we're like storing the raw body text and then parsing it for the whole API. You could do that for individual objects. That's going to get really hairball really fast. But you could do that. Like you could keep extending this to your other things, but now you're going to get all these other different data types all over the place, which is probably not what you want. So I click API call here, yeah, and you see we get this uncaught exception because the thing I tried to store, this list of body events, is in fact its individual objects are each unserializable because they're these objects with functions on them. But we did show that if we just captured the whole body text, we could read that back in, and that doesn't become an error. The other thing that I wanted to say, I guess, is if it's enough for you just to save the stuff that's coming off of these, your API calls, whether they're an action or data. If it's enough just to, you don't need to save the objects, but it's okay just to store the things that are coming off the object. You could set up a floppy reader, right? That just does a whole bunch of stuff. So like, I think the easiest way to explain this would be, we'll set it up over here in store, and then we'll fix our types, right? So like, let's say that store key one, like, so what scalars do I have that come off of result of step one? So I've got, I guess they're almost all lists. So we'll clear this. Whoop. Clear this. Clear this. Clear this. All right, so we'll just save some lists. So let's see, we could like save, now we can't save a body event, but we could save, let's see, boop, 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 boop. I could save the days blocked, right? I could save result of step one's, starts. That's a list of dates. I could save, let's see, result of step one's body ends. I could save, let's see, result of step one's, locations, descriptions, we could save the locations. That's a text. All right, so what did we do here? So we've got a date list, a date list, and a text list. All right. So let's see. Let's actually clear this. So set that to none. We'll just go down to our list keys. So we've got, this is a date list, date. I guess this was supposed to be, what was this supposed to be? Days blocked. I think this next one was starts. Date, starts. This probably starts. This was a date. Date. This is ends. And let's see, I think my fourth one was a list of texts. Oops, I hate that that happens. Date. Key 4 is text. And this is like, or is it descriptions? Doesn't really matter. Descriptions? Descriptions. Live bubbling with Keith. Days blocked. Days blocked. Resolves to a list of. Oh, well, the call's not set up right. Again, this was just a demo. So that was my list 1 is a list of texts. Whatever. Whatever. List 1, a list of texts. Okay. All right. So there, like I'd be saving 4 keys at the same time. So we could like run this, and then we could go look at our application. So we will run this. And now you see that if I hit API call, we're going to do the things. And then over here in my IRD API calls, I should have some lists stored. And yes, I do. Right, so I've got my days blocked, which I inadvertently set as a text. So they're showing up as their text representations. I've got descriptions, ends, and starts. And they're all in there. So these, right, these are these are some like simple bubble data type lists that are hanging off of that API call, and now I could just put them in local storage. And so you might want to think about future whether like this, doing something like this would suffice. Like, do you really need to store the entire API call? Maybe you do, maybe you don't, but I would think about that. And anyway, that's also a quick introduction to Floppy Reader, which is kind of cool. Note that Floppy Reader is not like a full replacement for Floppy. It doesn't have all the extra code for like the list manipulation stuff and stuff like that. So it doesn't have like the RAM list and the RAM scaler. It doesn't have the the step mode function. It doesn't have all that other crazy stuff. It's just simple and streamlined, just for like reading and writing. And the intent is that you might use Floppy to like write a bunch of keys, and then on some other page you would actually use Reader to just read the value of all of those keys very simply back into your page. So that's maybe all I'm going to talk about. This has been a very long video, and I hope you found it interesting rather than confusing. But anyway, it gives you a lot to think about and a lot to play with. And it is an interesting concept. I do wish that the bubble model for things and the bubble model for these API objects was a little simpler, right? It's like there's kind of no reason like for the data type of the like a data API call to be different from an identical action API call, right? Like that's a little silly. We actually saw that. Like the format of those objects is very, very similar. It's this bubble applies this naming convention to them, and apparently the name is important. Like they consider the source important. This is similar with things, where with things can only exist by being created in the database, right? And they have a unique ID. And so we can't create like a temporary object in the page. Like we should be able to say in a plugin to say, okay, here I'm going to make an object with all the right fields except for unique ID, which is going to be empty. And I'm going to say that that's a thing. Bubble just doesn't allow us to do that. Like the create new thing action is like only through the database. Whatever. I could talk about this for another hour, but I won't. I hope that helps, and I hope other people maybe find this of general interest. I will talk to you later. Keith out.